Good evening. My name is Shayna Hertzfeld, and I am a student project manager for the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples that live with these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of St. John's Episcopal Church on the Square, the Clark Forum, and Dickinson College, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality, which is this year's Molly and Wayne Borges Memorial Lecture. The purpose of this lecture is to honor the lives and ministries of Wayne and Molly Borges through an annual event featuring a person well qualified to address topics of importance relating to spiritual or social issues. As a joint venture of St. John's Episcopal Church and Dickinson College, the Borges Lecture brings together the area of religious and college communities together to learn from presenters of recognized accomplishment and expertise. Growing up, I learned about Israel in the context of Judaism. And as I got older, I became aware of Israel and Palestine in a secular and political context by watching the news and talking to older family members. Since coming to college and declaring a history major and political science minor, I've had yet another opportunity to learn about the region, this time in an academic setting. Learning about the same situation in different contexts has provided the opportunity to see the state of Israel and this conflict from varied perspectives. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Ian Lustick, will give us a chance to learn about the area, its history, and the current political situation in yet another light. Dr. Ian Lustick is the Emeritus Bess W. Heyman Chair in the Political Science Department of the University of Pennsylvania. He has also taught at Dartmouth College and worked for the Department of State. He served as a member for the Council on Foreign Relations and as past president of both the Politics and History section of the American Political Science Association and the Association for Israel Studies. Dr. Lustick has created a technology-based application which is used by the Department of State, the National Counterterrorism Center, various branches of the intelligence community, and more. He has written and spoke on a variety of subjects, including Middle Eastern and comparative politics, social science methodology, U.S. foreign and national security policy, and social science-based computer simulations. His scholarship includes the book he will discuss tonight, Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality, which explores the failure of long-term negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. In it, he argues that acknowledging the deep-rooted nature of this conflict and advocating for a one-state solution will clear the way for better problems. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that accessible exits are located on the west side of this building. And now, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Ian Lustick.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank both St. John's Church and the people here at Dickinson who've made my visit so interesting and so comfortable. I want to say that the date of today's talk was a date required by the convenience of the college and my own schedule. However, in my view, it's a very appropriate date. Today is Memorial Day in Israel. This is perhaps the most solemn day of the year in Israel, where those who have been killed in the conflict are mourned and remembered. What has changed in recent years is an increasing participation of Palestinians in the same memorial service with bereaved Jewish parents, remembering their kinfolk who have died in the conflict. That is a matter of some controversy in Israel, but it's very appropriate as we talk about the one-state reality. Something happened, in fact, this morning about that, which brings that home. The government made a decision not to allow Palestinians from the West Bank to attend memorial services, even though 128 of them had been invited to share in a moment of bereavement, of mutual recognition of loss. At the very last moment, the Supreme Court in Israel overruled the defense ministry and insisted that those Palestinians should be allowed to come and participate. We all know that the protests in Israel have to do with the conflict between the current government and the principles that the court stands for. So right now, today, in Israel, the mourning that took place was at least in part a joint bereavement, representing in a new way the one-state reality that includes all those between the river and the sea, even if they are not living equally in that state. Now, I have a nice set of PowerPoint slides for you tonight, and I'm going to discuss them. But before I do, I want to actually read something that will kind of contextualize what I'm going to say. Now, occupations usually have two things in common. They are conditions of coercive control, and they are temporary. Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip 56 years ago, is still a relationship of coercive control, but it is no longer temporary. It is permanent, or as permanent as circumstances can be in politics. This is not the result of the settlements per se. Obviously, 650,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank outside of East Jerusalem is a factor, but that's not the factor itself. What is really this is a function of, this permanence, is the scale of Israel's transformation. Its transformation into the kind of a state required for what has been necessary for the settlements to succeed. A massive transfer of property from Palestinians, the relocation of nearly 750,000 Israelis, and a fateful shift in the political dominance of certain forms of Zionism over others. That is what has really changed. So what is the future of an occupation that is not temporary? How does such an occupation end? It can or could have ended, at least, via withdrawal of the occupying power. That's how how did the occupation of Japan end? The United States withdrew, sort of. We still have military forces there. That kind of an end to the occupation will not happen. It did not happen, and it will not happen. And not at least as a result of negotiations. Maybe there'll be some catastrophic war at some point. But occupations end in other ways. Indeed, most occupations in history ended not by withdrawal, but by absorption. Here in Carlisle, you can turn to the Civil War to see what I mean. The end of the North's occupation of the South, and they were considered occupied territories. From living under military occupation, the inhabitants of the southern states found themselves living as inhabitants of, and then eventually as citizens of, the state that had occupied them, the North. Indeed, that is how Israel's occupation of the Galilee, the northern part of the country, which was mainly allocated to the Arab states, and when Israeli forces took it over in 1948, they were referred to as occupied territories. Nahariya, for example. But it was absorbed so that the people living there were equally citizens of Israel. They may not have always experienced equality, but whether they were Arabs or Jews, they became citizens of Israel, and no one refers to those areas as occupied anymore. Not because Israel withdrew from them, but because Israel absorbed them. So when we're looking to end an occupation, we have to remember that in the one-state reality, there's another way it can end. It ends so that the rules that apply to and govern populations on one side of the line also apply on the other side of the line. Since that is presently not the case, since the State of Israel includes Judea, Samaria, or the West Bank, the Jordan Valley, the Gaza Strip, but does not rule Arabs or Jews who live there, as Arabs and Jews are ruled within the Green Line, the occupation has not ended. But it still can end by the extension of equal status to all who live within the domain of the state, either through the formalization of systematic discrimination based on nationality or democratization. That is, you could make everything the same by being equally discriminatory through the whole country. Or you could do it in another way. It's the equality, it's the sameness that makes the end of the occupation. Either way, the occupation will end with a change in the regime that enforces and promulgates laws in that state that calls itself Israel, so that all living within it enjoy what President Biden has repeatedly said is the fundamental principle upon which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should end. Quote, "The Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live safely and securely and to enjoy equal measures of freedom, prosperity, and democracy." He doesn't say that has to happen in 2 states or 3 states or 1 state. The principle is equality. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, a way to achieve 2 states for 2 peoples was available for attaining those objectives. For years, that has not been available. When so many really prefer systematic discrimination and dominance to democracy, continuing to try to bring about 2 states when that can't be done automatically means entrenchment of oppression and the concealment of something very akin to apartheid behind a veil of mostly disingenuous blabber about negotiations which will never happen, but which is in the interest of many people to pretend may happen. The real way forward is a gestalt shift, a paradigm shift in the way we think, so that we appreciate that the way toward the complete end of the occupation is the direct struggle for equality, democracy, and mutual national self-determination within the one state that already really exists. This is real. One state does exist from the river to the sea. It's not a small, cozy Jewish democracy. It is a one-state reality. It's not a solution. It's not a pretty picture. What I'll talk about today is how the problems of the one-state reality can become, if not a solution, then a set of better problems. So what have I done here? I've given you the conclusion of the lecture at the beginning because I want you to see where I'm going to be going. I'm going to be giving you some background, and you otherwise would wonder, what is this all about? Now I think you'll see where I'm going with this, I hope. Paradigm lost comes from, of course, paradise lost. The meaning of that is that for many people, the 2-state solution was a paradise. A cozy Jewish state, still Zionist and Jewish. A Palestinian state, which maybe is not perfect for them, but can get us out of this guilt of having destroyed their national community. The world will recognize us both. Thank God it's possible. It's giving that idea up. That it's not just losing a paradigm, it's losing a paradise. And people are resistant to it for understandable reasons. I was resistant to it. We start back in the 19th century. This area of the world is a backwater of the Ottoman Empire. Very little attention paid to it. A variety of administrative districts, the Mutasarriflik of Jerusalem, the Vilayat of Beirut. Some people would call this southern Syria, a bunch of Ottoman provinces. A sleepy, but actually quite prosperous in some ways, and productive Palestine. Palestine was one of the biggest cotton producers in the 18th century, for example. This is a typical kind of village picture. Has nothing to do with what's going on in Europe in the late 19th century. Completely nothing to do with it. But in Europe, there's something going on that has nothing to do with what's going on in Palestine. Namely, industrialization and the rise of nation states have led to an upheaval that promises emancipation and enlightenment for Jews, but also threatens them tremendously because the new governments that come into power are reliant on mass opinion, and conservative forces can only win by appealing to bias and imperialism and anti-Semitism. So in the East, this area known as the Pale Settlement, where Jews are allowed to live, and only allowed to live mostly in this area of Eastern Europe, where my ancestors are from, ruled by the Tsars, a new policy of extreme oppression is adopted. 1/3 to be converted, 1/3 to be forced to leave, 1/3 to be killed. That was the policy. And you get pogroms throughout the area in the late 19th and early 20th century, fostered by the government, which is completely different. Used to be anti-Semitism came from others, in the state, which relied on Jews for tax collection and loans, protected the Jews. Now it was different. Now the state was starting to be an enemy. Not just in the East, where most Jews lived, but also in the West. 1895, a grossly anti-Semitic treatment of Dreyfus, falsely accused of betraying the French to the Germans, and the massive outpouring of support for this anti-Semitism in France, so that France was torn for decades between the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. So on both the East and the West, a rise of anti-Semitism that made Jews wonder that the Enlightenment really wasn't the door to safety after all. What was the door? Well, many Jews tried to think of ways out of the Jewish problem in Europe. The most popular way was just listen to the rabbis and do whatever the rabbis said, which was, my children, it's always going to be bad. Put your heads down, pray, wait for the Messiah. That's what we can do. And most Jews did that. Another very popular was socialism. The reason for anti-Semitism is capitalism. When the world is reorganized socialistically, we won't have it. And so Jews were extremely prominent in the socialist and then the communist movements and in the revolutionary movements. And they had their own socialist revolutionary movement called the Bund, which wanted to establish Yiddish-speaking enclaves throughout Europe based on workers' rights. But the very popular option was to leave. That was the traditional way. If you were in Germany in the Crusades, and the Crusades happened and Jews were persecuted, then you went to Poland. If you were in Spain, you were kicked out of Spain, you went to Antwerp. You went to the Caribbean. You went to the Arab world. You went to Turkey. Now where are you going to go? Here, the United States and Britain. Between 1885 and 1914, 1.5 million Jews left Eastern Europe and came to the United States or Britain. How many went to... Now, then there was this other idea. How about if we completely change Jewish life? A much more radical solution. That's the Zionist solution. What does it mean? That the reason for anti-Semitism is that Jews are weird. It's their abnormality that triggers Gentiles to be anti-Semitic. If we were Gentiles, we would also be anti-Semitic. After all, what are we going to do with these people? They look different. They eat different. They pray different. They believe different. They keep to themselves. They won't even touch our food. Who are they? And they, when there's a plague, they don't die as much as we do. They must be doing something, because they're actually washing their hands all the time. So Zionists said, until we are a normal people, not only are we going to be unhealthy, we are going to always look at ourselves as dependent on others, scratching around for pennies instead of being peasants, being workers. We have to normalize ourselves to be a normal people. But the key thing is we have to have one country where we are a majority. Yeah, there's France for the French. There's a majority of Frenchmen there. There are French minorities in other countries, but nobody thinks they're strange. It's normal. That's what we have to have. Now, at the beginning, Zionists weren't particularly interested in Palestine. Anywhere would work, as long as they could get a majority. That didn't last so long, because if Jews had the choice of going to the United States or Britain, they're not going to go to Argentina or Uganda. They could be attracted, perhaps, romantically to the land of Israel, to Palestine. Only 75,000 in this whole period, Jews left Eastern Europe, and half of them left Palestine. It was too hard, or died of malaria. So the ones left were incredibly dedicated people, highly ideological. Like if you think of the people you know who are, their whole lives, they're active in politics, and they're ruthless about getting ahead in politics. That's all they care. And now take 75,000 of those people, they're the ones who came to Palestine, looking to live out theory that they had at the situation in Europe. Now, the Palestinians had, who were these people? It's like Martians coming here. It's a little like the way the Muslims looked at the Crusaders. Who are these people dressed up in furnaces, riding around on horses that are bigger than anything we've ever seen? It was like, what is this? So what happened? In 1897, look at the way these folks look. Do they look Middle Eastern to you? This is the first Zionist Congress where Herzl, who was outraged at the Dreyfus trial, and a lot of folks from Eastern European communities declared, well, we are founding the Zionist movement, and he wrote in his diary that if I had to sum up the Basel Conference in one word, which I shall not do openly, it would be this. At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say this today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, certainly in 50, everyone will see it. What happened 50 years later? 1947, the UN Partition Resolution. But Herzl himself, only 7 years after this, when faced with the terrible problem of Palestine, because there are all these Arabs there, and the British offer him Uganda. We can have a Jewish state in Uganda, or Jewish community in Uganda. And Herzl, the great hero of the movement, recommends it to the World Zionist Organization in 1904. And they say no. They vote against him, narrowly, but they voted against him. And he died of a broken heart. And the Zionist movement was stuck with Palestine. And in 1948, David Ben-Gurion, under the picture of Herzl, declares independence. And we're going to get there by another route in a minute. Now, I skipped ahead to the whole mandate period, the whole British mandate period. The British took over Palestine in 1920, essentially, after World War I. The Ottomans lost, and the British and the French divided up the Ottoman lands of the Middle East under the terms of the League of Nations and Wilsonian self-determination principles. They were supposed to get areas of the old Ottoman Empire and treat them as vehicles that would produce independent nation states. They weren't really colonies. They were supposed to be mandatory territories. And the mandate was help these people eventually become civilized partners in the international community so that they will be independent. And you're supposed to help them. So the French were supposed to do that in Syria and Lebanon. The British were supposed to do that in Iraq and in Jordan and in Palestine. And they all had their ways of avoiding exactly that, but especially the British in Palestine. The British instead adopted a policy which was a very complicated one that backed the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Nobody knew what that meant. The British, however, knew what it didn't mean, because the Zionist organization had drafted the Balfour Declaration, what was supposed to be the Balfour Declaration, saying Palestine is going to be reconstituted as the Jewish state, and the Zionist organization is going to be in charge of it. That was what the Zionist organization wanted the British to say. But the British took out most of that language and said, no, there's going to be a Jewish national home in Palestine, not a state, and it's not going to be the whole country, and we don't tell you what a home is, and it's not that Zionists are not going to be in charge of it. We're not saying it, and we're not saying that it's the reconstitution of the old Jewish kingdom. But the Zionists took what they could get. And the League of Nations included the Balfour Declaration in its mandate. So the British always had to do something to let Jews in, even though the Arabs completely opposed it. Once they saw that the objective of the immigrants was not just to live there, but to transform the country into a Jewish country. That set off, even in Ottoman times, when they saw the first Zionists come in the 1880s, they were not like the Jews who had lived there for a long time, who were just living there. No, these Zionists said, we want to change the country. So the Palestinian representatives to the Ottoman parliament brought petitions and said, you've got to stop this immigration. These people are not just coming to live here. They're coming to take the whole country. And the Ottomans tried but couldn't because the European colonialists controlled. They were so in debt to European colonies that they could not protect Palestinians. They didn't care that much about them. And the British and French and Russian consulates were more interested in extending their influence in Palestine, helping and protected Zionists in that way. But here you see a picture in the Mandate period of the leadership of the Palestinian Arabs, religious and national, and clan leadership. In Jerusalem, that's the Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock in the background. I'm just giving you this picture as a sense of, wow, the country was organized. It was not like a Bedouin roaming around or poor villages. There were urban centers in Jaffa, in Jaffa, in Haifa, in Tiberias, in Jerusalem, in Hebron, in Nablus. Here is Palestine in the Mandate period. The British separated the East Bank and said that's going to be the Emirate of Transjordan because we owe something to Abdullah, who is the current king of Jordan is called Abdullah. His great-grandfather was named Abdullah. The Balfour Declaration will only apply west of the Jordan. This is now Palestine. This is Transjordan. This is a graph of population change. Arab population growing from 1850 under 400,000, dipping terribly during World War I when it was a famines, and then increasing rapidly. The Jewish population, Zionist immigration started right around here, 1885, very slowly increasing. As I told you, only 75,000 came in this whole period. But then with the rise of Nazism and a change in British policy, which allowed more Jews to immigrate in the 1930s, it started skyrocketing up. Okay? But you still see that the overwhelming majority, about two-thirds, in the late 40s was Arab. Now, somebody asked me today, I had several wonderful sessions with students here, were there different perspectives on this issue? And of course, people disagreed on what to do, but the more basic disagreement was what is the problem? You know, if you can't agree on what the problem is, there's no way you're going to even be able to talk about the solution. And what I want to show you is that that was the basic problem during the Mandate period. What was the problem? For the Arabs, the problem was simple. It was ordinary. It was just a typical problem in Wilsonian self-determination. Here you have a colony under the League of Nations. So the League of Nations' job is to organize it so that there can be free elections, and according to the language and national affiliations of the population, they will elect a government, and that will be the state, whether that's called Slovakia, or it's called Bosnia, or it's called Syria, or it's called Egypt, and here it's called Palestine. So it's typical. The job of the problem is self-determination of a geographically defined nation. What was the Zionist position? No, that's not the problem of Palestine. The problem of Palestine is the international Jewish problem, the affliction of the entire world, with his constant waves of anti-Semitism, to say nothing of the affliction of Jews with constant waves of anti-Semitism. Palestine is the problem. That's the problem. So it's unfair to count how many people there are in Palestine, give them to vote what's going to happen, when there are 16 million Jews in the world that should be voting, because that's the problem. And in fact, when the British offered elections, the Zionists said no, because they knew they would lose the elections. They had to wait until all Jews all of the whole world could vote, because that's the problem of Palestine. Now, what did the British think the problem of Palestine was? They also thought it was an ordinary problem, but an ordinary problem of imperial management. We have colonies everywhere. India, Ceylon, Egypt, and it's always the same. You got natives of one kind, and you got natives of another kind, and they're all screaming at each other for one reason or another. And who knows, you can barely speak English. And we, of course, know how to govern, and we help them, but it's hopeless, really. You can never get them to do what they need to do. And also, since it's not really important, except for India, sometimes we do what our leaders have a fantasy of doing. They want to make India a new empire. Or sometimes it's because we do something because we're competing with the French or the Russians, and therefore, sometimes we do something because, well, we'll let the colonial officers, whoever they are, decide what's fair right now. And sometimes we just say whatever is good politically for the current prime minister. Well, that's very typical. That is how imperialism operates. In fact, that's what imperialism is. That is, what is crucial for you in the colony is just incidental for me. I just do what I do, and you have the results. I don't do anything because I care about you. That's typical British policy. So, if we look a little closer, we can see this in action. Here's Lloyd George, who was prime minister when it all started, and he was a millenarian. You know, one of his little quirks was that he thought the second coming, the Jews would be part of the second coming, so why not let them back in Palestine? It can only be good. Then there's this wacky guy, Ord Wingate, who was a jungle fighter from Burma, who they brought to Palestine to teach the Haganah how to eat snakes, be Green Berets, and really be brutal in their fighting. And he was also a very extreme Christian millenarian. So he thought he was also bringing about the apocalypse or the redemption of the world by doing this. This is an interesting note. The British mandate received Palestine from the British occupying army. The British occupying army was outraged at the idea that these Zionists were disrupting all the life of the Arabs and were very haughty about it from the point of view of the British army. And they said, we are going to have a disaster if we let the Zionists in under the terms of this mandate. But because of this kind of sentiment, he was overruled. And the new High Commissioner was a Jewish bureaucrat named Herbert Samuel, who had had a wonderful career as a colonial administrator in Ireland. And now they brought him and sent him to Palestine. The general in charge of the British troops on June 30th, 1920, wrote a note, a sarcastic note to Herbert Samuel. He so despised the idea of what they were doing. This is a receipt, received from General Sir Lewis Bowles, one Palestine complete. I'm giving it to you complete. That's it. I want you to remember that. It was Palestine, one country, complete. Now we're going to go through a period of time where maybe it won't be, or now it is. In 1930s, so much, you had a pattern in the 1920s and early 30s where you'd have you'd have Jewish land expropriation, Jewish land acquisition, which entailed expelling peasants from their land when the land under them was bought from the landowners who had the deeds. And then that would cause, among other things, riots against Jewish immigration, which would then trigger a British investigating commission to go to Palestine and report back that the problem was that Zionism was creating tremendous suffering and discontent. We had to reduce the commitment to Zionism, but not stop it, and make sure we could protect Arab peasants. Then, in every case, Zionist power in London would shift British policy to revoke the findings of the commission, give a fillip to Zionist immigration, provoke more Arab unrest and riots and demonstrations. Another commission would come. They would recommend the same thing. It would be reversed again and again. Finally, in the mid-30s, the British sent the Peel Commission. This is what they look like. Actually, this is Peel. Okay, so you can see the hats. It's just perfect for Palestine. They decided that this is an irrepressible conflict. Not our problem. I mean, we didn't cause it. It's just these wacko, foreigners. It's an irrepressible conflict. We're going to have to divide the country. And they divided it. They had a map. Okay, the green area will be Jewish. The tan area will be Palestinian, Arab. And this will be international or British, from Jerusalem to Jaffa. Didn't work. The Arabs said, this is an outrage. We don't accept this. We want the whole country to be one country, independent. The Jews were not enthusiastic about it, but enough of them were willing to consider it as a starting point that they even agreed not to demand all of Jerusalem, all the old city of Jerusalem. But they didn't accept this map. What they did like about it was one thing squirreled away in the details. And it came back to haunt the Palestinians in 1948. Ben Gurion, who was the leader of the Zionist movement, more than any other single person, had always worried about the Arab problem and argued against people in the Zionist movement who said the solution to the Arab problem is getting rid of them, transferring them. Even Herzl said it in his diary. We have to spirit the penniless masses over the border. Ben Gurion said that's not possible. We're going to have to find another way. I don't know what it is yet, but we have to find another way. But the Peel Commission, when it gave its plan, said that hundreds of thousands of Arabs from the Jewish state would be transferred out into the Arab state so that there would be a Jewish majority. Otherwise, there would be no Jewish majority there. Ben Gurion said, did you see that? The Gentiles are ready to allow us to expel Arabs. That's fantastic. So even though we don't take the Peel Commission report, we got to remember that. And in 1948, that came back, and Ben Gurion was in charge of what's going to happen to the Arabs in Palestine. So the state of Israel is recognized in 1948 after the UN partition plan to divide the country according to an even more complicated map, Jewish, Palestinian, kissing points. It was supposed to be such a complicated map that the only way they could survive is to cooperate. Ha ha ha. War broke out almost immediately. Both sides took the initiative, especially the Jews who saw areas of the country that they wanted that were not in their territory. In the process, you had a civil war that lasted from November 1947 to May 1948. Then the Arab states invaded when Israel declared independence in the middle of May 1948. Jewish refugees from Cyprus, escapees from the Holocaust, started arriving in masses. Israel joined the UN. Didn't look so well for the Palestinians. They became the refugees. So there was a Jewish state, but no Arab state. No Palestinian state came into being, excuse me. Now, I should say that there was an attempt by Palestinian representatives who saw the war was not going well. Let's negotiate with the Zionists to set up this Palestinian state. And they went to Lausanne, Switzerland, where there were negotiations hosted by the UN. But the Palestinian delegation was not able to enter into the negotiations because the new state of Israel cooperated with Jordan, the king of Jordan, Abdullah, to say, we don't want to talk to the Palestinians. And instead, it was Jordan that took over the West Bank, and Israel and Jordan basically divided this whole area between them. And Egypt took the Gaza Strip, Israel took this area. So you had a triumph in 1948 and for the Jews and a catastrophe for the Palestinians. Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. This is a classic picture of a Palestinian man holding the key to his house with his deeds. This is an iconic kind of picture. To give you a sense of it, this is a map. Every dot is a village or Arab locality that existed prior to 1948. The 1948 war, and especially the massed expulsions that occurred, mean that all the red dots are gone after the war. Only the green ones remain. Why in those particular areas there are green dots here and green dots there, we can go into that in the question period. So this is not any controversial story I'm telling you. It's a sad story, but it's not controversial. This is Defense Minister Dayan in Golda Meir in 1967. These are new Jewish immigrants, settlers, sleeping under mosquito nets in an abandoned building, that is an Arab abandoned building in an Arab locality called Arida that was evacuated. When the Jews came in, they needed someplace to live. They were desperate. They put them in abandoned Arab villages. That's an example. Conditions were not nice for anybody. This is a quote from Moshe Dayan in 1969, 20 years after the war, talking to Jewish students, Israeli students at Israel's MIT, the Technion. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of those Arab villages, and I do not blame you, because geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books do not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. Nahalal arose in the place of Mahalul, Kibbutz Givat in the place of Jibta, Kibbutz Sarid in the place of Hunifis, and Kfar Yeshua in place of Tal El Shuman. There is not a single place in this country that did not have a former Arab population. What happened to Abdullah? That's his grandson, King Hussein, who later became king. Shortly after this picture was taken, he was assassinated by a Palestinian, outraged that the West Bank, Palestine, had been forcibly annexed by Abdullah. So now you end up with this map, not what helped Palestine complete, but the West Bank ruled by Jordan, the Gaza Strip, where the Egyptian military remained after the 48 war, ruled by Egypt. Not as a part of Egypt, but as an occupied territory. But the West Bank was annexed by Jordan. So what we see in 48, that Israel appears and Palestine disappears. Then in 1967, 19 years later, Israel takes over the West Bank. This is a war that was started by threats from the Arab world to destroy Israel. Israel preemptively struck and won in 6 days, took over this entire Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, Palestinian territory in the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And Israel has ruled the West Bank and indirectly Gaza ever since. Now, after the 1967 war, the question of the Peel Commission idea of partition arose again. Of course, it arose in 1947 when the UN thought of it, but it was flushed. It didn't happen. After 67, some people started to say, okay, if Israel now can withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, maybe we can go back to the idea of dividing the country. Maybe the Palestinians. So the partition reemerged as a potential solution. There are some people who had always talked about it like that. The communists, for example, had always said partition was the solution. But very few people other than that had consistently said so. After 67, for moderate Israeli Jews, many of them felt, a comfortable democratic state maybe not everybody would be Jewish. There was a 15% minority, remember the green dots, of Arabs, but most people would be Jewish. So it would kind of be a Jewish democracy as long as we don't talk too much about the Arab minority. That'd be much better than ruling over these huge populations of Arabs. There were in 1967 about 600,000 Arabs in the West Bank, after about 250,000 were expelled, and about a couple 100,000 Palestinians in Gaza. Now there are 2 million Palestinians in Gaza and 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, plus another 350,000 in expanded East Jerusalem. The debate was between, shouldn't we see these territories as an opportunity for peace and to preserve the Jewish character of the state, or on the right, no, the crucial step on the road to the Messiah coming and to redemption of the world is Jewish settlement and rule over all the land of Israel. So some of our rabbis tell us. They had to find, it was hard to find the rabbis, but they could find a few. This was the debate. For most Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza in this time, in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s and so on, even if the PLO said, we want a separate state in all of, a democratic secular state in all of Palestine, it didn't seem possible. For them living under occupation, it would be much better to have an independent state for West Bank and Gaza Palestinians. And there are lots of refugees in the West Bank and Gaza who would be better off if they had an independent state to live in it. But of course, Palestinians outside of Palestine didn't have too much of an interest in that. So there's a struggle inside the Palestinian community over whether the two-state solution would be something worth pursuing, as well as there was a struggle inside of Israel over that question. But at least the idea of partition had reemerged. Let's look at it a little more closely. Right after the Six-Day War, some people in the Israeli government, Yigal Allon, a famous commander from the 1948 war, proposed what later became known as the Allon Plan. And although the government did not adopt it officially, unofficially, labor governments used it to decide what to do. The official decision was, we're deciding not to decide. Why? Because if you would try to decide, you would split the government into the groups that never wanted to negotiate, never wanted to withdraw from anything, would leave the government, and you'd have to have new elections. Who wants new elections? But the problem was that the Palestinians, some of them kept saying, let's negotiate. And even as early as 67 and 68. So the military government passed rules that said no Palestinian political action, no matter how peaceful, is allowed. And they banned all assembly of Palestinians, no matter how moderate they were. In fact, the most moderate people were deported. Why? Because any Palestinian initiative, except a PLO demand for something that no Israeli would accept, would trigger the need to debate over what we're going to do with the territories and split the government and call for new elections. So that decision not to decide, but under the table, the Allon Plan was, we'll settle these areas and keep them eventually, but there'll be enclaves which we won't settle, and we'll let the Palestinians have some kind of autonomy there. Some unspecified kind of entity will exist for Palestinians. That was the Allon Plan. At least, you see, it had the idea of partition of some kind. But the labor government, which thought itself as eternally in charge of the Zionist movement, because Ben-Gurion and so on, lost the 1977 election. There was an earthquake, it was called in Israel, a shock. The arch enemy of Ben-Gurion, Begin, won. The man he had called Hitlerite won the elections. And his position was absolutely afshal, not an inch from which we will withdraw. And he and Ariel Sharon, his key minister, launched a massive settlement campaign directed to the areas that were supposed to be preserved from settlement. So you can see, he was elected in 1970. That's when the Labor Party was settling in this area here mainly, and around Jerusalem. But by 1980, you can see that the Likud governments, the Begin, is settling right in the middle of Samaria and in Judea, down here. 1990, 2000, 2010, 2016, the expansion of settlements going from about 1,100 Jewish settlers outside of East Jerusalem to about 500,000 in 2016. Now, one heritage of this was, of course, the biggest, most important attempt to actually achieve a partition solution was Oslo. Oslo negotiations started in early 90s secretly between the PLO and a Labour Party government, a very weak Labour Party government. The leader of that government, the Israeli government never said it was agreeing to a Palestinian state. But from the Palestinian point of view, this is what everything was going to lead to. And many, like me, thought that if this would get going, that's where it would end up. Of course, this is so the map of Oslo said, well, in the meantime, we're going to divide the West Bank into 3 parts. There's going to be the green areas, which will be Area A, and in those areas, the Palestinians will rule in some kind of autonomy, and we won't go in there except when we really have to. In the brown areas, that's Area B, and there'll be shared responsibility for governing these areas between us and the Palestinians. But in Area Gray, in Area C, we rule that area. We can do anything we want in that area. This is just temporary. Okay, temporary defined in 1995. It's still, the only part of Oslo that's still alive are these distinctions, except that the Israeli army goes into everywhere whenever it wants. So the distinctions have lost a lot of meaning, but not all meaning. I want you to notice, well, I can't notice on this map. We'll go to the next slide. On this map, you can see how things have changed. Israel's settlement activity has extended way into the middle of the West Bank. You see, it's not there. Now there is like what it is an archipelago of Palestinian ghettos. That is really what the West Bank is now. And no one imagines anymore any route that is possible to negotiate backward. This is the Trump plan. Why do I show this? Because it's very deceiving. You look, wow, the state of Palestine. Now, because it said the state of Palestine in the plan as some end state, the right wing in Israel, the people who are now in power, those ministers you hear so much about, they absolutely reject the Trump plan because it even said the idea of a Palestinian state. Even though if you read the plan, and I'm probably one of the few people in the state of Pennsylvania who've actually read all 80 pages of this plan, there is no Palestinian state down the road. What it is, it's too complicated. I've written about it. Anybody who's interested, I'll send you the article. What it is if Israel ever decides that the Palestinians have become Norway or Denmark, then they can decide that Palestinian state called Denmark can become Palestine. If they do decide that, then the state of Palestine will actually be a series of islands connected by choke points which the Israelis will control. But one of the very interesting things about the Trump plan that I liked was this. You've got 2 million people in Gaza. Most of the overwhelming majority are refugees from this area, which is largely uninhabited. So Trump, for the first time, said we can let them back into areas inside the Green Line, inside Israel, in these little godforsaken areas down by in the desert. That's where Palestinians will live. That was the first time that a plan that any Israeli prime minister, and Netanyahu responded positively to this, accepted the idea of a return of Palestinians into what had been Israel from 1949 on. Okay, the epic struggle over what to do with the occupied territories. This man, Meron Ben-Venisti, was perhaps the most quoted Israeli in the 1980s and 90s in the New York Times. He ran something called the West Bank Data Project, funded by the United States in the 80s, to count settlers, to count infrastructure projects, to count settlements, and count how much land was being expropriated. because, he said, it was approaching the end of the possibility of reversing a process of de facto annexation. And he said that within 3 years there will be 100,000 Jewish settlers, and then it will be politically impossible ever to leave. He and I had arguments all the time. I argued that, you're right, it's a serious problem, but even 100,000, it could be overcome. I look at Algeria, I look at Ireland. The French got out of Algeria. Yes, they almost had a civil war to do it, but they got out. So we would argue. He died a few years ago. I wrote an obituary for him, but he wouldn't have liked it that I was writing his obituary. He was writing the doom. It was becoming an endemic intercommunal conflict. I couldn't tolerate that. I said, it's possible. It's a horrible thing, but it's possible that will happen, but we can stop it. Now, the right wing loved him because he was saying, all you have to do is put a few more settlers in, and you got the whole thing. In fact, the left said Ben-Veniste was working for the right because he was demoralizing the left. He may have been right. Ben-Veniste had deep whole land of Israel sympathies, but that's not for this lecture. When the Intifada broke out in 1987, years into it, when it stunned Israelis, the West Bank seemed like the Wild West, not a place you wanted to live for a while. And Ben-Veniste himself started to change. I never said it was impossible. I said it might become impossible. It was not inevitable that there would be a Palestinian state. Now, within a few years, the settlers were back on track, and he shifted his position again. Said, see, I told you, it's all over, and he dissolved the West Bank Data Project. The point of no return has passed. And in fact, there has been a victory of just what he saw, of de facto annexation. It happened. I didn't say it couldn't happen, but I was trying to see how it could be stopped, and it wasn't stopped. Not since 1999. How many years is that? 24 years? Has an election in Israel produced a government committed in any form to the two-state solution? And there's no prospect of that happening in the foreseeable future. You can't think of a constellation of parties that could happen. All that's left of Oslo are the ghettos of Area A that I showed you, and the politically potent image of maybe there could still be, which helps people, as I'll say, prevent them from engaging with the real problem, which is equality. Now, I'm going to give you some interesting quotes from the period of this Ben-Veniste warning. In the early 80s, how long ago was that? 50 years? No, 40 years. 40 years, okay, 40 years ago. This is Meron in October 83. Within 36 months, there will be some 100,000 Jewish inhabitants of the West Bank. If this occurs, it will become impossible for any Israeli government to relinquish control. And Moshe Alon, you read Israel's Founders and Sons, one of Israel's great writers and journalists. February 1983. For all practical purposes, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza have already been annexed to the state of Israel, perhaps irrevocably. Perhaps irrevocably. 1983. Yehuda Litani, for a long time, one of the two main West Bank affairs correspondents for Israeli large newspapers, Haaretz, Davar. Within just 7 weeks, negotiating initiatives for a territorial compromise could be irrelevant because of the settlements. Danny Rubenstein, the other leading Israeli journalist of the time for Haaretz and Davar. January 82, there is no chance that Israel will be able to give up as much as 1 meter in the West Bank and Gaza, even if it wishes to do so. Shmuel Toledano, I won't go into who he is, but he was an Arabist and a member of the Shin Bet. Within a few years, if anyone were to suggest giving up any part of the territories, it would be regarded as no different than giving up the Negev or the Galilee. 40 years ago, Hirsch Goodman, correspondent for Jerusalem Post. For anyone who has spent even a little time in the West Bank recently, it must have become obvious that de facto annexation has taken place. An uncharacteristically energetic and efficient arm of the government's bureaucracy put into motion a process that in 6 years has created facts that any rational person must concede are irreversible. This is from the 1980s. John Kerry, spring of 2013, when I wrote my New York Times article saying the two-state illusion, and Kerry is launching this negotiating initiative to have a two-state solution. And Obama is saying, "What do you face? Go ahead. You want to do this? You do it, John, but I'm not having anything to do with it." I believe the window for a two-state solution is shutting. I think we have some period of time, a year and a half or 2 years, or it's over. He said that in 2013. What do you think he said 2 years later? Is it over? No. It doesn't go away, no matter what, because it's a lifeline. It's a paradise that people, diplomats, politicians need to pretend is available. And many supporters of Israel need it for emotional reasons. They need to believe it can be true, because the alternatives are to fight for something that's hard to fight for in this context, namely equality of all who live in the state. So now we get to this guy's argument. And I start out with what is an ontological question. What is something, really? Ontology is the study of reality, what is actually out there. We can see things, but what is behind what we see? You often see things that aren't there. What is the real thing out there? What kind of stuff is it? Well, if you look between the river and the sea, what do you see? What is there? What is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea? That is, I said, an ontological question. Is it the state of Israel plus territories that are not part of the state of Israel, but are controlled largely by it? Is that what's there? Or is it one state of Israel? Different parts of the country are ruled, inhabited by different kinds of mixtures of people, and they're ruled in different ways. What is it that you see? It turns out it makes a huge difference which one you see. Now, what is an ontological question? I don't want to just say what I said and let it drop at that. I'm going to come at this a little weirdly. I do this in the book in more detail. What is fire? What is it? Well, it depends on whether you operate it in an Aristotelian world or not. What is your metaphysical sense of what the world is? That is beyond your ability to touch it. What is your imagination? What is the world like, really? Well, Aristotle believed the world was made up of 4 things. 4 things only were real: earth, water, air, fire. Fire was a real thing. One of the 4 elements. Out of that idea came the idea that things burn because they have fire in them. The fire was called phlogiston. And right up through the Renaissance, into the 17th and 18th century, all of metallurgy was based on the theory of phlogiston. The amount of phlogiston in something determined how much it burned. And when the phlogiston was gone, it stopped burning. Now, it was a little bothersome that when you weighed what was left after you burned a log, it weighed more than the log did to begin with. Get rid of the phlogiston, and it weighs, well, we just got to forget about that. There's some, but they kept finding it. So phlogiston scientists came up with all kinds of arguments about why that was true. Oh, I know. Phlogiston has a negative weight. So when it's gone, it actually increases the weight. No, it's sort of like a buoyancy effect. Well, eventually, Lavoisier and others were able to measure things really precisely, and within about 40 years, oxygen and combustion became the explanation. But it meant that you had to have a completely different ontological idea of what fire was. Fire wasn't a substance, one of the 4 elements. It was an effect of a complex interaction of fuel, heat, and something called oxygen, that when molecules, which is also something you didn't know about before, these little things that can heat up and move, and then you get this stuff called plasma. Oh, all right. So that's what fire is. It's an effect. See how that's you can't appreciate the truth. You can't do good science unless you change your ontology. Now, the people in charge of the old science do not want to give it up because they don't understand the world. Their whole careers were based on the old ontology. So you know when people have to change basic assumptions, it's going to take a long time. The two-state solution is like this: to abandon the idea that Israel is Israel with territories that it might someday not rule, to shift to seeing it as one country that Israel rules in different ways, that's an ontological shift. It means changing basic ways of seeing things, but it yields more satisfying answers to more interesting questions. In the long run, it's going to win out. I don't say the one-state solution is going to win out. I say the one-state reality is going to win out over other ways of analyzing the problem. So what and where is a state? I keep saying the state, and you say, Gaza? Gaza is inside of Israel? What are you talking about? Why do I say that? Israel has no official boundaries. I'm a stamp collector. My specialty is cartophilately, which means the study of maps on stamps. I have hundreds of copies of stamps with maps on stamps. But I have no stamp from Israel with a map of the country on it. Italy, yes. France, yes. The United States, yes. But not Germany. Every country you can imagine, not Israel. Why? Don't want to say what their borders are. Never have said what the borders are. So what is part of the state named Israel and what is not? You can't go by the borders, per se, because they don't really exist officially. The definition of a state used by political scientists is the institution that enforces property rights. And if you come back at me with Weber's, I will show you that it's the same thing. That is, if there's no state, I can't plant anything because you'll come around and steal it when it comes up. I have to have some rights to my property. The only thing that gives me that right is a state that I know is going to punish you if you try to take my crop. The same thing, a state collects property taxes. It allows me to keep my home standing if I pay the taxes. I have property rights, but only because I pay the state to do it. If there is no state, I don't have any home anyway. Somebody's going to come and take it and destroy it. So so you can tell who a state is, who the state is somewhere by who gets to decide whether a house stands or not. If you have faith that your house, you know the conditions under which your house can remain standing, it's because you know what the state requires of you to do that. In this case, the only state, the only government that decides whether a house in Gaza or in Nablus or in Haifa or in Sachnin, an Arab village in the Galilee, can stand is the state that calls itself Israel. It alone decides whose house gets demolished and whose doesn't, whose gets built and whose doesn't. Anarchy means no property rights. In parts of Lebanon and in civil war, nobody has property rights. And in parts of Palestine, that's almost true also. It's not that the state is strong everywhere. Sometimes there's no state. But the only state that is there is Israel. Now, how many of you know Wittgenstein? Wittgenstein makes a distinction between grammar and ordinary language. Grammar is the official word you speak, the diplomat's language. Where are the borders of Israel? Where are the borders of our country? The ordinary language is what people actually think and it's manifested in their daily speech. When they don't think about, wait a minute, if you're in France in the 1960s, in the 1950s, and the UN is discussing what to do with Algeria, and you are furious because what has The UN got to do with an internal problem in France. Algeria is a part of France. Why France treats Algeria better than Britain treats Ireland. Wait a minute, whoops. I just said France treats Algeria. That means Algeria is not France. You see, that's ordinary language. Couldn't keep speaking. So that's how you tell where a state really is. Look at its ordinary language. When I was doing my research on my book on Algeria, and I wanted to see what the French really thought of Algeria in the 1960s, I didn't look at what the Foreign Affairs Ministry said. I went to the construction ministry. What do you want? I want the maps of all the construction projects in France in 1960. Okay, here it is. I look through them. I see them in Orleans. I see them in Normandy. I see them in Provence. So where are the projects in Algeria? Oh, that's in the colonial section. That's ordinary language, ordinary bureaucratic language. Of course, you can't think of it as not inside. So let's look at the ordinary language of the Israeli state. So here's the official state of Israel map for the districts and sub-districts and natural regions inside the country. And you see Judea and Samaria and these borders. Gaza is not an official district, but they're in the same category. What you see there is a district boundary by the legend of the map. These are district boundaries, not international boundaries. Here's a map of internal migration inside Israel. Where are people moving to and from? So they're moving from inside here into Judea and Samaria. Some are moving there, but Judea and Samaria is an example of one area in the country into which people are moving or leaving. Here's a map from a book on hiking in Israel. Do you see? No, not hiking in Palestine. This is hiking in Israel. There's no difference between Judea, Samaria, Gaza. Here's the weather. They're not showing you the borders. Oh, no, that's not Israel. No, it's all Israel. This is a tourist map. You can hardly tell where the West Bank is. And I love this. This just came out from the private organization, the Israeli Mint. Memorial, a commemorative coin for the 75th anniversary of the state, which is about to occur. Look at the map. Now, that's not an official Israeli organization, but that's the natural map. One Palestine. It's not just the possibility that two states could be negotiated that is dead. For years, even before I wrote my article on the two-state solution, illusion, people have been saying the two-state solution is dying, or is it dead? I mean, how long does it take to die? So I wrote, this is from my book. Since the Second Intifada, a question and a metaphor have come to dominate public discussion of the two-state solution. The question that hangs above its advocates like a sword of Damocles is whether de facto annexation has rendered the project impossible or so implausible that the entire paradigm of separating the West Bank from Israel as the route to peace must be abandoned. The prevailing metaphor is death. Has the two-state solution died? I have a footnote for each of this. These are different New York Times, European and Jewish commentators, Israeli commentators. Has it died? Is it on life support? Is it dying but not dead? Or is it dead but not buried? Or is it dead as a dodo? Did the United States give the two-state solution the kiss of death when it recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital? Or was it the act, its death knell? There is no doubt the two-state solution is definitely in trouble, if not on its deathbed. Or is it in a death spiral? Should it be allowed to die a natural death? Or is it dead, or is it long dead and decomposing? Or perhaps it should be considered almost completely dead and closer to death every day. Is it in trouble but not dead? Did the two-state solution die, or was it put to death? Can we see signs of possible life, or only the reflexive twitching a dead body can sometimes exhibit? So should we say it isn't dead, but it is dying? That it is stuck but not dead? If it's dying, perhaps the two-state solution can be rescued and resuscitated. A major symposium in the Jewish periodical Moment magazine was titled, "Is the Two-State Solution Dead?" Instructively, 4 years later, the New York Times published a long article with the same title and effectively the same analysis. 2017, the New York Times. This is the New York Times last week. As this board has argued for years, the security and even survival of the Jewish state depend on eventually achieving a durable peace settlement with the Palestinians to include a formation of a state of their own. The two-state solution has been all but moribund. Well, that's a new one. All but moribund. So, as I said, the reason for this failure is that Israel has changed. It was a kind of blue state. Massachusetts, Connecticut, in some ways was progressive, social democratic. In the 1980s, it became a purple state. It became Ohio, Pennsylvania. One election goes to Likud. One election goes to Labor Party. Always narrow, switches completely the policies, drives everybody crazy. After the Second Intifada, it became Oklahoma. Israel is a deeply red state. The protests you see in the streets are of one entire class that's being left out of the power in the government, and they're the educated, cosmopolitan, Tel Aviv and Haifa and Rehavia living elites who actually can shut down the country because they're the ones who know how to do everything. Now, that's a generalization, of course, but that's actually why Netanyahu stopped this, because the 20% of the population that really is in the streets is a population that can shut the country down. But it's not the population that can win elections, not by itself. My book goes into why this is, what accounts for this transformation, which is what makes the two-state solution impossible. And I don't have time, I don't want to take up the time to go in detail. One argument has to do with something called the flaw in the iron wall. Zionist theory originally was, we don't know what to do with the Arabs. We don't have anything to offer them, which we would take if we were them. So the only possibility is not to negotiate with them now, but to wait until they give up. That means we have to keep beating them in wars, and eventually they will divide into some group that will accept half a loaf and another group that will just have to keep on fighting. That was actually a very sensible approach, and it worked to a great extent. Israel built an iron wall that has military capacities to defeat any Arab revolt. They kept defeating the Arabs with casualty rates that were much higher on the Arab side. And in the 60s and late 60s, early 70s, the Arab states, Jordan, the Palestinians, Egypt, started to come and wanting to negotiate. But there was a flaw in the iron wall. The iron wall argument said, well, Jews are normal, so the Arabs are normal. The normal people will give up some of what it wants if it loses all the time. That was the idea, and in fact, the Arabs did respond that way. But what does a normal people do when it wins all the time? It doesn't go back to what it was willing to settle for before all those victories and all those casualties inflicted by the enemy. No, it says, hey, what they lost on the battlefield, they're not going to gain at the negotiating table. So Israeli demands kept expanding, which is what is normal. That's what's normal. That was the flaw in the iron wall theory. Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion didn't necessarily realize that. So that's one reason that with every victory to encourage the Arabs to make peace, Jewish forces in Israel expanded, maximalized their demands, so that there was less and less room for agreement. Then there's the way the Holocaust was remembered in Israel. Remembered in a way, eventually, that made it extremely difficult to distrust non-Jews, because at heart, by the dominant view of the Holocaust after 1977 for sure, was Gentiles are endemically oriented towards eventually becoming anti-Semitic and even Nazis. So we cannot trust any Gentiles, and we cannot allow anything to happen that might be the seeds of Nazism, and especially with the Arabs, because they're the closest already to the Nazis. And this cult almost of traumatizing and re-traumatizing Jewish population. And believe me, I'm Jewish. I lost a lot of relatives in the Holocaust. Nobody's traumatized more than me. so that every time you see barbed wire, or you hear the word crematoria, or you see a chimney, or you see a truck, or you hear the word carbon monoxide, everything comes back and hits you. And that's what Israeli Jews live with. Everyone basically considers, well, the polls show that it's more important in the minds of most Jews in Israel and in the United States that you remember the Holocaust and you believe in God or the Torah or any other part of Judaism. So that has undermined the ability of political leaders in Israel to offer programs which would compromise with the Palestinians and treat them as equal, responsible partners, people who it's worth giving something to get something to. The third factor is probably the most important because it has to do with us. The Israel lobby in the United States, which never intended to have this effect, it only intended to protect Israel from undue American pressure. But because of the way the United States is organized, a small pressure group, an effective pressure group in foreign policy can hobble any president. Think of what the Cuba problem does in Florida. The Israel problem does. It prevents presidents from doing what they know they should be doing, and they're trying to, but when they turn to their domestic affairs advisor, no, it's not worth it. And they always back down, always. Whether it's Reagan, or it's Ford, or it's Nixon, or it's Obama, or Clinton, they all responded the same way. Carter. So the reason it's called the cocoon is because it created a cocoon around Israeli democracy. No pressure from the United States. And that meant that politicians that could have emerged in Israel as winning prime ministers, people like Yossi Beilin, or Shulamit Aloni, or Yossi Sarid, brilliant Chaim Ramon, they all lost. They were all destroyed, all prevented from taking power because everything they said about the United States was wrong. We can't have everything we want. We can't have the West Bank and aid from the United States. They won't let us. This is going to be a disaster, and it wasn't. The right kept saying, no, you can have everything you want. We can keep all the territories, no rights to the Palestinians, and we'll still get plenty of American support. And they were always right. So what that did was it forced Israeli politicians to the right if they were going to win elections. The whole system got shifted way to the right of what it would have been had it not been for the success of the Israel lobby. That's not what the lobby wanted, but that's what it got. Last two slides. We have, in 2005, massive right-wing demonstrations to try to stop the disengagement from Gaza. Now, I say Gaza is still effectively ruled by Israel, surrounded by it. Mail is delivered only through Israel. Taxes are collected. Nothing stands in Gaza unless Israel agrees that it stands. Nothing goes into Gaza unless Israel agrees, and so on. But there was a disengagement. The settlements were removed. Massive protests. Civil disobedience. Nails on the roads. The army had to go in and dismantle the settlements. 2023, massive protests against the overhaul of the judiciary. Left and center. Now it's the other side of the political spectrum, or the center, that doesn't like what's going on. What were they protesting about? The idea that the Knesset thinks it is omnipotent and can make a decision against the Torah, against Jewish national values. How dare they think that the elected Knesset, legal or not, has a right to do that? What, do you think they're omnipotent? That's what the right was saying in 2005. They feared an omnipotent Knesset. Now, in the one-state reality, it's the left and secular centrists that have the fear, because the right knows it controls the parliament, it controls the government, so it wants it to be omnipotent. That's what the judicial reform is all about, to give the Knesset total control over what it does. It can do anything, take rights away from Jews as well as from Palestinians. It can do anything. Why the shift? One side is making this argument here, no omnipotent Knesset. The other side is making it here. What changed is the one-state reality. As long as the right feared that a government could impose a two-state solution, they didn't want the government to have the power to do it. Now that they know that no government can impose a two-state solution. It's impossible. Now they want the government to be able to do anything it wants. That's why you get the same pattern, 18 years later, but to different players. I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to skip this. Well, I'm going to say one thing about this, because I guess there is this slide, two more slides, this one and another one. Jerusalem offers an opportunity to see what the future might be a little better. Jerusalem was drawn after 1967, a new border, which you can hardly see here, goes way up here. All the brown areas are Palestinian. The blue areas are Jewish settlements. And now there are 350,000 Palestinians living in the municipality of Jerusalem. But very few of them are citizens of Israel. They're all citizens of Jerusalem. Because what Israel did was not annex the territory to the state of Israel. Remember, it doesn't know where its boundaries are. It expanded the boundary of the city of Yerushalayim to include 71 square kilometers of the West Bank, thereby making the people who live there citizens of the city, but not of Israel. But they can vote in mayoral elections. They can. They haven't because the Palestinian Authority has told them not to. It's accepting the occupation. Of course, my argument is, yes, you should accept it. It's done. But your life is miserable because you're not voting, so all the resources go to the Jewish areas. And in the last election for mayor in 2018, the number of votes separating the extreme right-wing mayor who won and the extreme left and the leftist center candidate, secular candidate who could have won, 4,000 votes. 3,000 Arabs voted out of 72,000 that could have and wanted to, but were intimidated by the PA into not doing it. But now the Jews realize that they can't have a civil, non-crazy municipality without an alliance with Arabs and without Arabs voting. So that's, in the long run, the route to democracy in all of Israel. The protesters will never be able to win elections unless Arabs throughout the country start to be able to vote. Now, inside the Green Line, they vote, but they don't vote in large numbers because they're not. You don't see Arabs in these negotiations. The demonstrators are still afraid to embrace Arabs as equal partners in the struggle for democracy because they're afraid they'll be tainted as Arab lovers by the other side of the spectrum. And many of them just don't want to do it themselves. What I'm suggesting is that's one way to society use the one-state reality as a gestalt shift. Wow, I can see new things, new opportunities I couldn't see before. And there are other payoffs to leaving behind the mirage of a two-state solution. One is that you don't care anymore that Jerusalem, okay, it's not going to be divided, but it's united. It's all one city. That means all Arabs in the whole country and all Jews in the whole country have access to it. Well, that's not a bad thing. Why should you worry anymore about one more Israeli settlement, whether it's in E1 or not? The United States keeps paying Israel over and over again for not settling in E1, this area that hasn't been settled yet. We pay them over and over again, diplomatically and economically. Why? It used to be because we have to keep the two-state solution alive. But you're not keeping it alive. the Israeli government's just used the idea that they're keeping it alive to get things for not doing irrelevant things. I'm not worried about another settlement in the West Bank anymore, even though I shed blood trying to stop them. I don't worry anymore. What's the difference? It means one fewer settlement in the Galilee. It means more land of Bedouin Arabs in the Negev protected. It's all one country now. We shouldn't be distracted. How about the demographic argument? What is the demographic argument? That's, look, I know you want to stay in the West Bank. I know you don't like the Palestinians. So get out of the West Bank. Let's not spending money on the settlements. You don't want to live with all these Arabs. There are 2 million Arabs in Gaza, 3 million Arabs in the West Bank. What do you want from them? Let's get out. You don't want to live in it. You want to live in a Jewish state, right? You don't want to live with those Arabs. That's the demographic argument. And the left had to keep making it, even though it was very uncomfortable and racist to make it, because it was the only way they thought they could get the majority of Jews to back withdrawal. It didn't work. Now that the left in Israel has been completely defeated politically, Meretz, the leftist party, was destroyed, did not make it into the Knesset. The Labor Party is reduced to like 4 seats. They need Arabs to vote. They need Arabs to turn out in order to be elected. So now they're forming new parties that are not Zionist, not based on the idea of a Jewish state, at least, because they need Arab votes. And they can't use the demographic argument anymore. Now the demographic argument, that racist argument, it used to be a progressive thing to say, it's not progressive anymore. Because you can't say, you don't want to live with those Arabs. No, you need the Arabs. Just like George Wallace won his 4th election to governor in Alabama, the arch segregationist, by kissing black babies. He mobilized black support against an arch segregationist racist he was running against, the Republican, and he won. That's how politics changes things. Jerusalem can be the first step, but in the long run, the disappearance of the demographic argument signals a wider possibility. We don't have to worry about US-sponsored peace negotiations. God, it's just an embarrassment. It's a humiliation for every administration. It's not going to work. And we shouldn't try anymore, because that's not the issue. The issue is it's going to fail. Obama knew that about Kerry. Kerry didn't know it, because Kerry is typical of all the envoys that the United States have ever appointed to try to deal with this. Some American lawyer who believes that the only reason the problem hasn't been solved is because they have not been given responsibility for solving it. And you can go back to Saul Linowitz, you can go back to Strauss, anybody, they all fit the same mold. Again, ending the occupation, yes, but it means through equality, not through withdrawal. Also, it means our models of the future have to change. We're not going to have negotiations toward a French-style withdrawal from Algeria, but political evolution toward a never-anticipated outcome. Just as the United States, no one in the Civil War imagined a multiracial democracy would come of defeating the South, but it did, as long as the enslaved people were not sent to Africa, and the white, they became part of the country, and they changed the country. The end of the occupation, through absorption, changed the country. It took a century, but that's the way democratization happens, unfortunately. This is the end. There are 2 epigrams in my book. One of them is Leonard Cohen. Sounded like the truth. Seemed the better way. Sounded like the truth. But is not the truth today. And my grandfather's favorite, Man tracht und Gott lacht. Man plans and God laughs. The things in politics that count the most don't occur because of a clever plan that's put into action and achieved. It's the unintended outcome of a struggles, of plans that never get achieved. There's no design solution that will be implemented. It's politics, both within Israel and internationally, that will produce, or can produce anyway, an inclusive outcome, not featuring a solution, but featuring better problems, which is really the goal of politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lustick. We are running short on time, so we are going to accept maybe 1 or 2 questions. As usual, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you prior to asking your question. And the first question will be for students, although Dr. Lustick is selling a few copies of his book after the event, and I'm sure he will be happy to answer any more questions you have. So we are looking for those 1 or 2 questions at this point.
Hello, thank you, Professor, for the lecture. I just have two questions to ask. The first one is, I think that mentioning the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian problems passed without mentioning the Israeli occupation taking over Sinai in Egypt. I think not mentioning this, disregarding the fact that the Israeli occupation is just looking for more land to have, and probably that's why they don't have an official stamp yet, just because they might get new land, they never know. And my second question is, we're talking about the Israeli and the Palestinian occupation and like what's happening there, and we never mentioned the violation of human rights that's happening in Palestine. every day against the people living there. Even the most recent one was in April 5th, when the Israeli occupation army entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque and like violated every human right towards the Palestinian people.
Correct. I didn't mention those things. And I can't mention everything. But it's an outrage. But that's what occupation is. It's arbitrary rule, and terrible things happen, and they happen every day. If there's not another question, I'll give you an example of what occupation is. And this is a story told to me by one of the journalists I mentioned, Donnie Rubinstein. I thought in the 70s, I was there during the first Intifada, in the late 80s, early 90s. I thought I was a very sophisticated guy. I really knew what was going on. I knew all the outrages that occurred. No, you couldn't fool me. I saw this article in the newspaper one day. Some Arabs in the Hebron area, Carlisle area, said that soldiers came and gassed them for no reason. They just gassed them and left them on the ground gasping for air. And the army said, no, this is made up. We did not do that. And I'm thinking, wow, I mean, that's really, why would they do that? There has to be, these are just, some things are just made up. It's crazy. And I had lunch with this journalist a couple months later, and I brought this up. I said, sometimes the Palestinians just go bizarre and say these crazy things. He says, no, that was true. I said, what do you mean it was true? He said, what happened is this. There were two gangsters, two crooks, and they wanted to rob a courier of a briefcase that was going to have a lot of money in it. He was going to be on the way to the bank. Their plan was to knock him out with gas, then cut the briefcase off his hand and run away with it. But they didn't, and they had the gas. They just didn't know how much gas they needed to use. So they put on the reserve army uniforms, went into the West Bank, found a couple Arabs, and experimented on them. So they could tell how much gas to use on the guy they were robbing. Oh, and I realized that is what occupation is. There is no law there for you. So anything can happen. Thank you very much. If you're interested in a copy of the book, I have a half a dozen. I can autograph them. They cost $20, which is a 30% discount. Thanks.
And this concludes tonight's event. Thank you all so much for coming.